Hello, everyone. My name is Eli Rickles, and I'm a senior music performance major here at Kennesaw State University. And I am very excited to share with you today some research that I conducted last semester, fall 2021, for my final paper in MUSI 3319, History of Jazz, taught by Professor Trey Wright. And this presentation, which is Sources of New Orleans Jazz Instrumentation, has been adapted from the content of that paper. So I would definitely say that the bulk of my musical knowledge lies in the classical and orchestral realms, Western classical music, but the topic of New Orleans jazz is still very dear to my heart, as my family has roots in the city stretching back to the 1870s on my mother's side. My ancestors immigrated from Eastern France, Western Germany, all the way to Texas, and then eventually settled in and around New Orleans, where half of my family still lives. I visit multiple times a year, and as you can imagine, New Orleans jazz is a part of the musical language that I remember from my upbringing. So without further ado, let's dive in. So, of course, when we talk about the source of anything or the origin of anything, we have to start with a little bit of broad historical context just so that it can be properly understood. So let's go back in time to the late 1700s in the city of New Orleans. Peoples of partial or full African descent begin to comprise more than half of the city's population, most of whom are also Catholic and French speaking. So as a result, we see both European and African musical languages predominate, in addition to a French liberal outlook on life that emphasizes having a good time with music, dance, good wine, good food, all that sort of stuff. And so now let's go not too far into the future. Let's just go to 1803 and talk about the Louisiana Purchase. So if you can remember from high school history class, Louisiana Purchase was when Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory from the French to incorporate into the United States of America, which not only included the modern day state of Louisiana, but also this vast swath of territory along the Mississippi River. And so as a result of that historical event, we start to see English-speaking Anglo and Black Americans. So we had, Catholic and French-speaking. Now we have English, Protestant-speaking individuals come into New Orleans, and the latter of whom introduced the city to blues and spirituals, which is a foundational pillar of the musical language of what will eventually become New Orleans jazz. And so now we're going to move forward about half a century to the pre and post Civil War area. So as I mentioned, my family immigrated to this country, on my mother's side at least, in the 1870s. So that would be post Civil War era. So this is where my family fits into the story of New Orleans jazz. And so we see German, Irish, Italian immigrants start to call New Orleans their new home. So as a result of all this migration and all this history, we have this very diverse city with people living in close quarters: Protestants, Catholics, white, black, Irish, Italian, French-speaking, English-speaking, you name it. And as a result of that, we see a high degree of intercultural interaction, which you can imagine will influence the musical language of the city of New Orleans. And so speaking of how intermingling of cultures affects musical language, when we discuss this topic and how that leads to the formation of new musical traditions, we tend to focus primarily on the musical language and the harmonic structures of that art form, so basically how the music sounds, but oftentimes we don't discuss the mechanisms about how that music is created and how those mechanisms are shaped by the intermingling of cultures. So not only does the sound of New Orleans jazz reflect a mixing of all these cultures, but the specific instruments that are used are also reflected through this. And so the focus of this presentation, what I would like to talk about today, is how three different sources of New Orleans jazz instrumentation converge to create the front line and rhythm section of the New Orleans Jazz Ensemble. Okay, so I just threw some fancy terms at you. Front line, rhythm section, what are these? So these are the two components of the New Orleans Jazz Ensemble that comprise the overall instrumentation of that ensemble. So the first one is the front line, which are the instruments that provide the melodic material of the New Orleans Jazz Ensemble, which are the cornet, or sometimes trumpet, the clarinet, and the trombone. And then the rhythm section is the instruments that support the melodists harmonically and rhythmically, so the tuba, the drum set, and either the banjo or piano. So now that we've laid out what the front line and rhythm section are in New Orleans jazz, let's talk about exactly what led to the creation of those two things anyway. And the first source of New Orleans jazz instrumentation that we're going to discuss today is the brass band. So in the 1880s and 1890s, brass bands grow in popularity in the United States. Both Black and white communities in New Orleans use them for public functions around this time as well. And these public functions include, but are not limited to, funerals, concerts, and political rallies. And this is the Jim Crow era. It's important to keep in mind. So these are racially segregated public functions, but we do know that both Black and white New Orleanians were using brass bands for these. And while we see this interest in brass bands arise, we also see an interest in ragtime and dance music around this time in the United States as well. And that ragtime and dance music predominates in casual settings. It's a casual form of music. It's not necessarily high art. And so a natural result of this is these very popular brass bands are now performing this very popular ragtime and dance music for casual entertainment functions like performances at amusement parks and in street parades, which I will show you in just a minute an example of a New Orleans brass band performing in a street parade. And with this adaptation of this ragtime and dance music by the brass bands, these musicians are able to show off their stylistic versatility quite a bit. So now I'm going to show you a clip of a brass band performing in a street parade in New Orleans. I apologize, there's a little bit of delay between the video and the audio, but I think you will get the idea of what this sounds like and what this looks like. And if you ever find yourself in New Orleans and you see these brass bands performing in the middle of the street, marching down the street, which is quite a common sight, I encourage you to join in on the festivities because it is quite a fun time. That's definitely always a fun time, a New Orleans street parade with a brass band. So let's talk a little bit more about this ragtime and dance repertoire that these brass bands are beginning to incorporate. So ragtime music was a good fit for brass bands because it allowed for a prominent role for brass musicians. Ragtime music is fun, very energetic, and something like that fits really well for a trumpet or trombone, lends well for those, for the family of brass instruments. But on the other hand, dance music a lot of times required that brass be mellowed out by strings, particularly the violin. This music was a little bit calmer, a little bit more high class, let's say, and so people didn't always want to hear the raucous sound of the brass. But there were less genteel dances, maybe more provocative dances, perhaps, that allowed for brass to play a more prominent role. So what we see is strings being the dominant melodic voice, the violin being the dominant melodic voice in these more polite dances, and the brass, so trumpet, trombone, dominating in these dances that were probably a little bit more fun, a little bit more provocative, less polite. And so we have this duality, and I guess this rivalry of sorts, but unfortunately it didn't really last. So I apologize for all the string players, the violinists listening to this presentation, but you all are the ones to lose out here because the brass-dominated dances draw the largest audience. I guess the public attitude, the public taste was more in favor of these kind of more fun, more raucous dances. And Not to mention, a lot of times these performances, these dances occurred outdoors, and playing a string instrument outdoors is not always the most practical thing because, quite frankly, an individual violinist is not very loud on their own. Typically, you need quite a lot of violinists in order to produce a loud sound outside. And so, as a result, brass is just more practical for this form of music as it develops in the city of New Orleans. Now the question is what this means for the course of development for New Orleans jazz instrumentation. And simply put, brass instruments secure their place. So the trumpet and trombone join the front line and the tuba joins the rhythm section. So we've talked about brass, but what about the percussion family of instruments, the all-time champions of loud music? So pre-ragtime and pre-dance brass band repertoire was typically performed while marching, as we saw earlier with the example of the brass band in the street parade. However, now that these brass bands, in casual settings at least, are primarily performing ragtime and dance music, we've run into a little bit of a problem. And that problem is neither of these art forms are executed well while in movement. And so we see, as a result, a new conceptualization of percussion born out of necessity that transforms the family of instruments in a way that is more compatible with sedentary ensembles. Introducing source number 2, the drum set. And what we're going to be talking about right now is the pedaled bass drum, which was popularized by Edward Chandler, a New Orleans drummer in the mid-1890s. So how did this thing work? Well, it actually worked very much like how a modern drum set bass drum works today, albeit the result was achieved much more crudely. So a spring was attached to the top of the bass drum so that a loose end, affixed with a block of wood, struck the center of the drum when pressure was applied to the pedal. After pressure was relieved, the wooden block would return to its resting place just a few inches from the drum. And believe it or not, this pedal was made out of a milk carton and it was connected to the bass drum with a chain. So if you picture a modern bass drum, you hit the pedal with your foot, the top of the pedal hits the drum head, and then when you remove your foot, the top of the pedal resumes its original resting place. So this old version of the bass drum, the pedaled bass drum, and the modern pedaled bass drum operate quite similarly. And the sound of this primitive drum set bass drum was likely bombastic, yet Chandler's innovation was imitated by other New Orleans drummers due to the convenience it provided. Now, why was it convenient? Well, it's actually pretty simple. This means now that you have a snare drum and a bass drum, part of the same instruments, you can pay one musician to cover two parts, cover the role of two musicians. So you save a lot of money. If you're sitting down, you can play the snare drum with your hands, as you can see in this picture here, and the bass drum can be covered with your foot. So you only have to pay one musician, so it's a lot cheaper for you. So Chandler's pedaled bass drum was quite innovative. Chandler's innovation was genius as it allowed a musician to additionally play a snare drum when seated. So one musician, two roles, cheaper for the band as a whole. And many New Orleans percussionists expanded on Chandler's invention by securing a clangor cymbal to the bass drum, which now is known as the HiHat in its modern form. And this three-piece drum set was now born: the snare drum, the bass drum, the HiHat. So now you have three roles consolidated into one individual. And the third and final source of New Orleans jazz instrumentation that we're going to discuss today is the clarinet, which joined the front line of the New Orleans Jazz Ensemble. So there were many reasons that New Orleans jazz ensembles appreciated the use of clarinet and used it in their performances. The first of which is the clarinet is a rather expressive instrument, and that makes it good for improvisation. So around the turn of the 20th century, musicians begin to place a greater emphasis on improvisation and personal expression in music. If you know anything about jazz, you know that improvisation is a central component of the art form, and in that regard, New Orleans jazz is not much different. Embellishment and tone inflection come naturally for the clarinet, which makes it easy to improvise with. The second reason is that it has a 4-octave range, which for a wind or brass instrument is quite a lot. And this 4-octave range lends to some interesting and inventive melodic counterpoint. Interest in melodic counterpoint is a staple in Western music, and that means that a secondary semi-melodic voice supports a primary voice. In the case of New Orleans jazz, the primary voice was the cornet or trumpet usually, and that secondary voice was the clarinet. And the final reason is the clarinets were typically part of brass bands anyway in New Orleans around this time, and so it makes sense that one of the ensembles that fed the eventual New Orleans jazz ensemble would carry over one of their most appreciated and respected instruments. And so on the right here, I have a picture of Doreen Ketchens, who is a famous New Orleans jazz clarinetist who I've had the pleasure of seeing live. And I'm going to show you a video of her playing. And I think she is a great example of what New Orleans jazz clarinet playing sounds like, or what the ideal sound of a New Orleans jazz clarinet is, because she is quite good. So in summary, due to the diverse cultural origins of New Orleans jazz, this genre's instrumentation is derived from a wide array of sources, specifically the front line and the rhythm section owe their individual instrumentations to these sources, the first of which is brass bands, the second of which is the advent of the drum set, specifically Edward Chandler's pedal bass drum and the clangor cymbal, or as it's known, the hi-hat, leading to the development of the three-piece drum set, the snare drum, the hi-hat, and the pedal bass drum. And finally, the clarinet, an instrument with an expressive nature and technical capabilities that allow it to really be great with improvisation and embellishments and things of that nature. So I would like to conclude this presentation by thanking Professor Trey Wright, not only for teaching a great history of jazz course last semester in fall 2021, but also for recommending me to speak on this topic as part of the College of the Arts Undergraduate Research Forum. And I would also like to give a thank you to Dr. Unick for assisting me throughout the preparation process. And of course, thank you to everybody who watched this presentation. I greatly appreciate you giving me the platform to express my fascination around this topic, and I am very excited to see everybody else's presentations as part of this research forum. So thanks very much.